Girl bought a used dress at a thrift store. What she never imagined was that in the dress pocket, there was a letter with dark secrets. Welcome to the channel. Enjoy the video. Give it a like, subscribe, turn on notifications, comment and share. The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished marble floor of the Mitchell Towers lobby, where Thomas Mitchell stood alone, clutching a cream-colored envelope in his trembling hands. The prestigious Manhattan building, worth millions in real estate value, suddenly felt cold and empty. His eyes fixed on the familiar handwriting that had addressed the letter, handwriting he hadn't seen in 15 years. Tom, as his friends called him, had built his property management empire from scratch, turning it into one of Manhattan's most respected firms. At 52, his salt and pepper hair and tailored suits gave him an air of success that masked years of hidden pain. The weight of the envelope in his hands seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. "Mr. Mitchell," his assistant's voice echoed through the lobby. "The contractors are waiting for you on the 20th floor. Tell them I'll be there shortly," he replied, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. He slipped the unopened envelope into his jacket pocket, right next to his heart, where a familiar ache had lived for the past 15 years. The renovation of this luxury building should have been the highlight of his week. Instead, his mind kept drifting to the letter from Rose Thompson, his former housekeeper. Rose, who had disappeared the same night his world had crumbled into ashes, literally. As the elevator climbed smoothly upward, Tom's mind wandered back to that fateful night. The smell of smoke, the screaming sirens, the devastating news that his 5-year-old son Matthew hadn't made it out of the burning apartment. His marriage to Sarah hadn't survived the tragedy. Nothing had. The elevator doors opened to reveal a bustling floor under construction. Workers in hard hats moved purposefully, carrying materials and checking blueprints. Tom nodded mechanically as his project manager detailed the progress, but his thoughts remained with the letter burning a hole in his pocket. Later that afternoon, seated in his corner office overlooking Central Park, Tom finally gathered the courage to open the envelope. His hands shook as he unfolded the letter, revealing Rose's neat handwriting. "Dear Tom, after 15 years of silence, I know this letter will come as a shock. What I'm about to tell you will change everything you thought you knew about that night. Your son Matthew is alive. He's been living in Brooklyn all these years, working at a coffee shop near NYU while studying business administration. I know I have no right to ask for forgiveness, but before you judge me, you need to know the whole truth. Rose." The letter slipped from his fingers, floating to the floor like a fallen leaf. Tom's world tilted on its axis as memories flooded back. Matthew's laugh, his tiny hands, the way he used to run through their Upper East Side apartment pretending to be a superhero. With trembling fingers, Tom reached for his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. After 3 rings, a gruff voice answered. "David Cooper speaking." "David, it's Tom Mitchell. I need your help." The silence on the other end lasted only a moment. "Tom, it's been what? 5 years?" "I know, but you're the only one I can trust with this. Can you meet me?" David Cooper had been more than just a detective when he investigated the fire 15 years ago. He'd been a friend when Tom had needed one most. Now retired from the force and working as a security consultant, David was still the only person Tom could turn to. They agreed to meet at their old spot, a quiet diner in the Upper West Side, where the coffee was terrible but the privacy was guaranteed. Tom arrived first, choosing a booth in the back, away from curious ears. David looked older, his hair now completely grey, but his sharp eyes hadn't changed. He slid into the booth without ordering, his attention focused entirely on Tom. "Before you say anything," David began, "I need to know if this is about the fire." Tom wordlessly handed him Rose's letter. As David read, his expression shifted from curiosity to disbelief, then to something darker. "If this is true," David said slowly, "then someone went to a lot of trouble to fake a child's death. The question is why?" Tom leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need to know if it's really him. David, I need to know why Rose took him, why Sarah—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "Sarah? You think she was involved? I don't know what to think anymore. My son might be alive, working in a coffee shop just a few miles from my office. All these years, while I've been building luxury properties and making millions, he's been—" Tom's voice cracked. David carefully folded the letter and handed it back. "We need to be smart about this, Tom. If Matthew is alive and someone went to these lengths to hide him, There might still be danger. Let me do some quiet investigating first. As they discussed their next steps, neither man noticed the woman watching them from across the street through the diner's window. Sarah Mitchell pulled her coat tighter around herself and hurried away, her heart racing. After 15 years, the carefully constructed walls of secrets were beginning to crumble. Back in his office that evening, Tom stood at his window watching the city lights flicker to life. The Manhattan skyline had always brought him comfort, a reminder of his success, of the empire he'd built from his pain. Now, it felt like a glittering facade hiding darker truths. He pulled out his phone and searched for coffee shops near NYU. How many times had he walked past his own son without knowing? How many chances at connection had slipped through his fingers like grains of sand? The night grew deeper, but Tom remained at his window, lost in thoughts of second chances and redemption. Somewhere out there in this vast city of dreams and secrets, his son was living a life Tom knew nothing about. But that was about to change. Little did Tom know his search for the truth would unravel a web of deception that went far deeper than he could imagine, threatening not just his carefully built world, but the lives of everyone he held dear. The next morning dawned gray and cold, typical for early spring in New York. Matthew Parker wiped down the counter at the Daily Grind, the coffee shop where he'd worked for the past 2 years. The morning rush was just beginning, and the familiar scent of freshly ground coffee beans filled the air. At 20, Matt had mastered the art of balancing his business administration studies at NYU with his part-time job, though making ends meet wasn't always easy. "The usual for table 6, called out Jenny, his co-worker, sliding an order slip across the counter. Matt glanced at the corner table where a well-dressed man in an expensive suit sat reading the Wall Street Journal. The man had been coming in every morning for the past week, always ordering the same thing, black coffee, no sugar, and always choosing the same table with a clear view of the counter. Something about the man made Matt uneasy, though he couldn't explain why. Perhaps it was the way the stranger's eyes seemed to follow him when he thought Matt wasn't looking. Or maybe it was how familiar those eyes seemed, like a half-remembered dream. Across town in a small antique shop in Brooklyn, Rose Thompson arranged vintage teacups with trembling hands. At 65, the weight of her secrets had become almost unbearable. The bell above the door chimed, and she looked up to see Sarah Mitchell standing in her shop, looking as elegant as ever in her teacher's attire. "I saw Tom yesterday," Sarah said without preamble, her voice tight with anxiety. "He was meeting with David Cooper at that old diner. You sent him a letter, didn't you?" Rose steadied herself against the counter. "He deserved to know the truth. Sarah, it's been 15 years. "We had an agreement," Sarah hissed, stepping closer. "We agreed it was safer this way. Do you have any idea what you've done?" "What I've done?" Rose's voice rose slightly. "I've carried this burden for 15 years, watching that boy grow up without his father, watching Tom suffer needlessly. All because of your fears, your paranoia about James's threats." Sarah's face paled at the mention of James, Tom's brother. "You don't understand. James would have destroyed everything, including Matthew. He still could." "James is dead," Rose reminded her firmly. "He died 3 years ago in that car accident in Connecticut. The threat died with him." "Did it?" Sarah's eyes darted around the shop nervously. "There are things you don't know, Rose. Things I've never told anyone." Meanwhile, David Cooper sat in his home office, surrounded by old case files. The fire that supposedly killed Matthew Mitchell had been ruled accidental, but he'd always had his doubts. The timing had been too convenient, coming just weeks after James Mitchell's failed attempt to take control of the family business. His phone buzzed with a text from Tom. "Found him. Daily Grind near NYU. Been watching him all week. He looks just like her, David." David rubbed his tired eyes. Tom's growing obsession with watching his son from afar wasn't healthy, but he understood it. How do you approach someone who doesn't know they're your child? How do you explain 15 years of absence without destroying their world? Back at the coffee shop, Matt was finishing his shift when he noticed something unusual. A woman with graying hair stood across the street, staring at him through the window. There was something familiar about her, something that tugged at the edges of his memory. Before he could get a better look, she disappeared into the crowd. That evening, Matt sat in his small Brooklyn apartment, working on his business economics homework. His roommate was out, and the silence allowed his mind to wander. He pulled out the old photo album he kept hidden in his desk drawer, the one Rose had given him on his 18th birthday. The photos showed a younger version of himself with a woman he barely remembered. His supposed mother who had died in a house fire. Rose had raised him after that, becoming the only parent he'd ever known. But lately, something felt off about the story he'd grown up believing. His phone lit up with a text from Rose. "Can you come by the shop tomorrow? There's something important we need to discuss." In his luxury penthouse, Tom paced restlessly, holding his own copy of an old family photo. In it, a 5-year-old Matthew sat on Sarah's lap, both smiling at the camera. The same smile he'd seen today at the coffee shop, unchanged by time. His phone rang. It was David. "Tom, I found something in the old case files. The fire inspector's original report was altered. Someone paid to have certain details removed." Tom's hand tightened on the phone. "What kind of details?" "Evidence of an accelerant." "Tom, that fire was no accident. And there's more. I found financial records showing large payments from James's account to someone inside the fire department, dated just days after the incident." The pieces were starting to come together, but they formed a picture too terrible to contemplate. Had his own brother orchestrated the events that tore his family apart? And more importantly, had Sarah known? As night fell over the city, 4 people lay awake in different parts of New York, each haunted by the weight of secrets and lies. Sarah stared at her ceiling, remembering the choices she'd made 15 years ago. Rose sat in her small apartment above the antique shop, preparing herself for tomorrow's conversation with Matt. David Cooper spread old documents across his kitchen table, searching for the missing pieces of the puzzle. And Tom stood at his window, watching the city lights blur through tears, knowing his son was out there just beyond his reach. None of them realized that the truth, when it finally emerged, would be far more devastating than any of them had imagined. The next morning brought a steady spring rain to New York City. Matt hurried through the wet streets toward Rose's antique shop, pulling his jacket closer against the chill. The closed sign hung in the window, but he could see light inside. Using his spare key, he entered, the familiar bell chiming above his head. "Rose?" he called out, shaking raindrops from his hair. The shop was unusually quiet, the antiques casting long shadows in the dim light. "In the back room, Matthew." Rose's voice wavered slightly, using his full name, something she rarely did. He found her sitting at her small desk, surrounded by old papers and what looked like photographs. "What's going on?" Matt asked, noticing the tears in her eyes. "You're scaring me." Before Rose could answer, the bell chimed again. They both turned to see Sarah Mitchell standing in the doorway, her expensive coat dripping onto the hardwood floor. Matt recognized her as the woman who had been watching him the day before. "You can't do this." "Rose," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "Please." Matt looked between the two women, confusion etched on his face. "Do what? What's happening here?" The tension in the room was broken by another figure entering the shop, Tom Mitchell, followed closely by David Cooper. The small space suddenly felt crowded with secrets ready to burst. "Mum?" Matt's voice was barely a whisper as he looked at Sarah, memories he didn't know he had flooding back. The woman from the photographs in his hidden album. But how? Sarah stepped forward, reaching for him, but stopped when Matt backed away. "Matthew, please, let me explain." "Explain what?" His voice rose. "Who are all these people, Rose? What's going on?" Tom stood silently, drinking in the sight of his son up close for the first time in 15 years. The same dark hair, Sarah's eyes, his grandfather's strong jaw, a perfect blend of the Mitchell family features. Rose took a deep breath. "Matthew, it's time you knew the truth about the fire, about your family, about everything. But first, you need to understand why we did what we did." She pulled out an old newspaper clipping dated 15 years ago. The headline read, "Tragic fire claims young life in Upper East Side apartment." "The boy in this article," Rose said softly. "The one who supposedly died. That's you, Matthew." The color drained from Matt's face as he sank into a nearby chair. "What are you talking about? My parents died in a fire when I was 5. You took me in, raised me." "No, son." Tom finally spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "We didn't die in that fire. You were taken from us. To protect you." David stepped forward, laying out several documents on a nearby table. "There were threats made against your family, Matt. Serious ones. Your uncle James Mitchell was trying to take control of the family business, and he was willing to go to extreme lengths to do it." Sarah moved closer to Matt, her hands trembling. "James threatened to hurt you if Tom didn't sign over the company. I thought the only way to keep you safe was to make everyone believe you had died in that fire. Rose agreed to take you away, To give you a new identity. But why? Matt's voice cracked. Why didn't you come with me? Why didn't you tell me the truth when I was older? Because James had people everywhere, Sarah explained. In the police department, in the fire department. We couldn't trust anyone except Rose and David. Even after James died, I was too afraid. Too afraid he might have left instructions with others. Too afraid of losing you again. Tom hadn't taken his eyes off his son. I never stopped looking for answers, Matthew. Never stopped hoping that somehow the reports were wrong. When Rose's letter came, the letter, David interrupted, pulling out more documents. It led us to uncover evidence that James had indeed orchestrated the entire thing. He paid off officials, created false reports, all to pressure Tom into selling the company. Matt stood abruptly, knocking over a nearby vase. No one moved to catch it as it shattered on the floor. So my whole life has been a lie. Every birthday, every Christmas, every memory, all built on lies. Not lies, Rose said gently. Different truths. The love was real, Matthew. Everything I felt for you, everything I taught you, that was all real. And what about my feelings? He demanded. Did anyone think about how I'd feel, discovering my entire identity is fake? That my parents have been alive all this time, watching me from a distance? Sarah stepped forward again. We were trying to protect you. Protect me. Matt's laugh was bitter. I worked 2 jobs through high school to help pay rent. I took out student loans for college. I've been struggling to make ends meet while my real father is some wealthy businessman living in a penthouse. Tom flinched at the accusation in his son's voice. Son, if I had known... Don't call me that, Matt snapped. You don't get to call me that, not yet, maybe not ever. The rain outside had grown heavier, drumming against the shop's windows. The sound filled the heavy silence that followed Matt's words. David cleared his throat. There's more you need to know. Matt, about the night of the fire, about why your mother agreed to this plan. But Matt was already backing toward the door. I can't handle any more right now. I need time to think. Matthew, please, Sarah called after him. But he was already gone, disappearing into the rainy streets of Brooklyn. The 4 adults stood in silence, surrounded by the physical evidence of their decades-old deception. The shattered vase on the floor seemed to perfectly represent the broken pieces of their carefully constructed lies. Give him time, Rose finally said, wiping tears from her eyes. He's strong, stronger than any of us knew he'd need to be. The following week passed in a blur of sleepless nights and unanswered phone calls. Matt hadn't returned to work at the daily grind, taking a sudden leave of absence that his manager reluctantly approved. He spent his days wandering the city, seeing it through new eyes, not just as his home, but as the backdrop to a lifetime of carefully orchestrated deception. From his apartment window, he could see the gleaming towers of Manhattan, including the Mitchell Properties buildings that punctuated the skyline. His father's empire, the reason for everything that had happened. The thought still felt foreign, uncomfortable, like a shoe that didn't quite fit. Meanwhile, Tom Mitchell sat in his office, staring at his computer screen without seeing it. The prestigious address and expensive furnishings suddenly felt hollow. What good was success worth millions if he couldn't share it with his son? His secretary buzzed, announcing another missed meeting, but he barely registered her voice. Sarah had taken leave from her teaching position, claiming family emergency. She spent her days sitting in her modest Upper West Side apartment, surrounded by old photo albums she'd kept hidden for 15 years, pictures of Matthew as a baby, as a toddler, all the memories that preceded that terrible night. Her phone lit up with a text from Rose. He's safe. Still processing. Give him time. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, Matt found himself standing outside Rose's antique shop again. The closed sign was up, but he could see her inside, arranging vintage jewelry in a display case. Using his key, he entered quietly. I knew you'd come back when you were ready, Rose said without turning around. There's fresh coffee in the back. Matt followed her to the small office where everything had changed a week ago. The familiar space felt different now, heavy with unspoken words and unexplained histories. I have questions, he said, accepting the steaming mug she offered. I know you do, and I promise to answer them all honestly. Rose sat across from him, her eyes tired but determined. Start with the fire, Matt said. What really happened that night? Rose's hands tightened around her own coffee cup. Your Uncle James had been threatening your father for months, trying to force him to sell the company. That night he sent men to scare your family, but things went wrong. They started a small fire as a warning, but it spread faster than anyone expected. And you were there. I was always there in those days, living in the apartment as your nanny. When the fire started, Sarah called me in a panic. She had discovered James's true plans. He intended to take you, to use you as leverage against your father. The fire gave us an opportunity we hadn't expected." Matt leaned forward. "To fake my death?" Rose nodded slowly. Sarah had already prepared emergency papers, a backup plan she'd arranged through David Cooper. When the chaos of the fire erupted, she made a split-second decision. She handed you to me, told me to take you far away, to use the new identity she'd created, Matthew Parker. But why didn't she come with me? She knew James would watch her closely after the fire. If she disappeared too, he would have known something was wrong. By staying, by playing the part of the grieving mother, she protected you. Matt stood up, pacing the small room. "And my father? Was he part of this plan?" "No," Rose said firmly. "Tom was kept in the dark for your protection. Sarah knew he would never be able to hide his relief if he knew you were alive. His genuine grief helped sell the story." Outside, the rain had started again, creating a soft backdrop to their conversation. Matt stopped at the window, watching water stream down the glass. "There's something else," Rose said quietly. "Something Sarah never told anyone, not even your father." Matt turned back to face her. "What?" "James had proof that Tom's company was built on stolen ideas, patents that originally belonged to your grandfather, James and Tom's father. He threatened to expose everything, which would have destroyed not just the company but your father's reputation. Sarah discovered this the night of the fire. So, it wasn't just about money," Matt said slowly. "It was about revenge. James always believed your father had cheated him out of his inheritance. The truth was more complicated. Your grandfather had chosen Tom to lead the company because James was unstable, dangerous. But James never accepted that. A knock at the shop's door interrupted them. Through the rain-streaked glass, they could see Tom standing outside, his expensive suit soaked through. Matt hesitated, then nodded to Rose. She went to let him in. Tom entered slowly, water dripping onto the old wooden floor. He looked older than he had a week ago, the weight of everything showing clearly on his face. "Matthew," he said softly, "I've been walking past this shop every day, hoping to see you." "Why?" Matt asked, his voice tight with emotion. "Because I have 15 years of apologies to make. 15 years of birthdays, graduations, ordinary days that I missed. Because every success I've had, every dollar I've earned, feels worthless compared to the time I lost with you." The sincerity in his voice made Matt's carefully constructed walls begin to crack. "Did you ever suspect that I might be alive?" Tom moved closer, but still kept a respectful distance. "There were times, moments when I'd see a boy your age on the street, and my heart would stop. But I convinced myself it was just grief playing tricks on me. If I had known..." "You would have what?" Matt challenged. "You would torn apart my life with Rose? Forced me back into your world of wealth and power?" "No," Tom said quietly. "I would have done exactly what I want to do now. Ask for the chance to know my son on his own terms." The antique shop had become their sanctuary over the next few weeks, a neutral ground where the broken pieces of the Mitchell family could slowly begin to heal. On this particular evening, as the sun set over Brooklyn, Matt sat with both his parents for the first time in 15 years, sharing a simple dinner Rose had prepared in her small kitchen upstairs. Sarah watched her son carefully cut his food, noting how he held his fork exactly as she had taught him when he was little. Some things, it seemed, time couldn't erase. "There's something else you need to know," she said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Something I've never told anyone, not even your father." Tom looked up sharply, recognizing the tension in her voice. Matt set down his fork, bracing himself for another revelation. "The night of the fire," Sarah continued, her hands trembling slightly. "James came to see me while Tom was at a late meeting. He showed me documents, proof that would have destroyed not just the company, but our family's entire legacy. But it wasn't just about the business." She pulled an old envelope from her purse, yellowed with age. "He had evidence that your grandfather, your father's and his father, had been involved in some questionable real estate deals in the 1970s. Deals that, if exposed, would have ruined not just Tom's future, but your future as well." Tom reached for the envelope, but Sarah held it back. "There's more. James was unstable, dangerous. He had already hired men to watch our apartment, to follow Matthew to school. He told me that night that either Tom would sign over the company or he would make sure we lost everything, including our son. So you chose to lose me anyway," Matt said quietly. "But on your own terms." I chose to save you, Sarah corrected, tears flowing freely now. Rose and I had already discussed the possibility of having to run. She knew about James's threats. When the fire started, it wasn't just an accident or a warning gone wrong. James had ordered it, but not to kill anyone. It was supposed to be a message. But you used it as an opportunity, Tom realized, his voice hollow. Yes, Sarah whispered. Rose took Matthew out through the service entrance while everyone focused on the main fire. David Cooper helped us with the paperwork. He had suspected James was dangerous and had been helping me prepare for the worst. The hardest part was lying to you, Tom. Watching you grieve when I knew our son was alive. Matt stood up abruptly, walking to the window. The city lights blurred through the old glass, much like his thoughts were blurring through his emotions. All these years, I thought I was Matthew Parker, just a regular kid being raised by his aunt after losing his parents. I worked hard, saved every penny, dreamed of maybe starting my own small business someday, and all this time, you were still that same person, Rose interjected, entering the room with a fresh pot of coffee. Everything you are, your determination, your kindness, your strength, that's all you, Matthew. Not your last name, not your family's wealth or secrets. Tom stood and walked to his son, stopping just behind him. She's right. And maybe that's the greatest gift Sarah and Rose gave you, the chance to become your own person, away from the shadow of the Mitchell name and all its complications. Matt turned to face his father. But what happens now? Do I suddenly become Matthew Mitchell again? Move into a penthouse, take over the family business? You become whoever you want to be, Tom said firmly. The company, the wealth, it's all there if you want it, but on your terms, in your time. What matters to us, is just having you in our lives again. Sarah joined them by the window, keeping a respectful distance. We've missed so many moments, Matthew. Your first day of high school, your graduation, your first job. We can't get those back. But maybe we can be part of your future moments. It won't be easy, Matt said, looking between his parents. I have a life, friends, plans of my own. I can't just erase Matthew Parker. We're not asking you to, Tom assured him. We're asking for a chance to add to who you already are, not replace it. Rose watched from across the room as the family she had helped protect, and in many ways helped destroy, began the delicate process of reconnection. The truth had finally set them free. But freedom, she knew, came with its own challenges. As the evening drew to a close, Matt made a decision. I'd like to keep working at the coffee shop, he announced, and finish my degree. But maybe we could have dinner together sometimes, get to know each other again. The relief on his parents' faces was palpable. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. And Rose, Matt added, turning to the woman who had raised him. You're still my family too. That doesn't change. Rose smiled through her tears. Of course not, dear. Family isn't about blood or names. It's about love. And sometimes love means making impossible choices to protect the ones we care about most. As they prepared to leave the shop that night, Tom handed Matt a business card. My private number, he explained. Use it whenever you're ready for whatever you need. Matt took the card, noting the embossed Mitchell Properties logo. I might need some advice, he said carefully. About business administration, since I'm studying it and all. Tom's face lit up with the first genuine smile Matt had seen from him. Any time, son. Any time. Sarah touched Matt's arm gently before leaving. We'll go as slow as you need. We've waited 15 years. We can wait a little longer to do this right. As the night settled over New York City, 4 people left Rose's antique shop forever changed. The truth had finally emerged from the ashes of that long-ago fire. And with it came the possibility of a new beginning. Not a fairy tale ending with everything instantly fixed, but something more valuable. A chance for a real family, built on honesty, understanding, and the kind of love that survives even the darkest of secrets.